Aatish, welcome.
Thank you.
Your third book, The Way Things...
My fourth book, my third novel.
Okay, the fourth book.
Stranger to History,
Stranger
The
to
Temple Goers, Noon,
Oh, Noon.
and The Way Things Go.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. There are many threads going through your book. Historical references. And you have now, it's a thread of English, used to be Urdu, now Sanskrit. In some ways going back to come to the present. It's a complex structure. I've seen many films like this. Flashbacks, comeback and all. Very complicated to write in terms of keeping your own head and the continuity in the right place. First of all, how did you think of this structure? Why did you choose this structure?
Thank you for that question, because actually it matters to me a lot. I'd been trying to write the story. I knew that my material was 1975 to 1992, and I'd been trying to write it straight for months. I would just sit down and think, let me just tell the story straight. And it wouldn't work. It wouldn't move. It was turgid. And I'd been reading all along the Kumarasambhava side by side, and in the Kumarasambhava there's this really beautiful dual structure. There's this weird sense of the world of the gods. They know about the world of men. The world of men acts by its own motivations, but it seems like in some ways to be aware on some subliminal level of the way of the world of the gods. And I suddenly sort of chanced upon this idea of a narrative in the present, a framing narrative as it were, in which you could feel the weight of the past. And I suddenly realized that the reason I hadn't been able to write was that this character, who's very placid, very still, waiting in a kind of state of passivity in Delhi, having cremated his father, Skanda, is waiting in some ways. It's a kind of a reckoning with the past through the whole course of the book. And the minute I could have him in the present, and you could feel the weight of that, I was able to move. Like it started to come very, very quickly. On your point about structure, it's much more instinctive than you realize. Like when you finish the book, you think that, did the author sit down and think like a kind of storyboard, or the way some people make a film?
A storyboard, like you make two threads and then you juxtapose it?
Not at all, not at all. It would be the opposite. It would be you working very close to the material, and things are occurring to you and you're moving, and actually it's very important to stay in that space and not to impose a scheme. In fact, it's very dangerous to impose a scheme.
So you go back to where you left off in another period and then keep coming back. That's so complicated.
You're just living with people. You're living with people, you're living with the story, and as you're moving, things start to suggest, it seems clear which part should go where.
It's very difficult to understand how anyone could work like that. I sort of visualize it that if I was to do it, I would write one part, then write the whole part, and then take out passages and juxtapose them together.
Yeah, very dangerous to do that. You'll find that for, at least for novels, that you can start to feel that it's schematic, and the minute that charge of something being schematic is imposed on a novel, a certain kind of organic quality, a vitality is lost.
You mentioned Lakramai Riram.
The tears of things.
Tears of things, all things.
Yeah.
Is this what your book is? Is it a tears of all things?
Such a it's from I think it's Aeneas who confronts this, the Lakramai Riram. And a super nice root there as well. Lacrimae, tears in Latin, related to dakru in Greek and ashru in Sanskrit. If you understand that concept, then of course that is the feeling, and it's there for. There's no way to explain that concept, you know?
No.
You can just hint at it.
Yeah, and you feel it throughout the book.
Oh wow! So thank you. I'm very happy to hear that.
Now, your romance with language. Now it seems from English, which you grew up with in school, Hindi, which I'm sure was spoken at home, and Punjabi was spoken at home. Badly. Then you learnt Urdu as your path to your personal journey to your father. And now Sanskrit. Explain to me, how did you... I can see you couldn't help the English and Hindi and Punjabi. Urdu, I can see the reason why.
My grandfather's an Urdu poet. I couldn't read him, yeah.
And then, how did Sanskrit attract you?
See, I'm going to say this very simply. In a place, let's say like England, where there's been less historical upheaval, someone working in a particular geographical space would be able to go into his literary past very easily. He would draw sustenance from it, he would need it. He would perhaps have to stop at Latin and Greek and learn a language and go further, or he would have to learn medieval English. In India, the way that history has left us, it's left us with these imporous layers between different points in the past. And somebody growing up as a writer in India in the 21st century couldn't go back more than 50 or 60 years. And it's crippling. It cripples the imagination. You feel that you're working in a particular geographical space, but you can't reach into it. You can't have any sustenance from the past. So these were not romantic exercises. They were very practical exercises of finding that how strange it is that someone should not be able to read his grandfather's poetry because of a historical event that has intruded and has left him one way at a distance from something that ordinarily he should have been able to read. So this, and my education, the way I grew up in India, didn't equip me for that. In fact, it taught me to have a kind of contempt for everything was local junk, you know, whether it was Urdu there was a little regard for, even though nobody bothered to learn it. With Sanskrit, it was considered a kind of mumbo jumbo. And there's a line at the end of Stranger to History where I'd felt that in some ways, the way that I'd grown up with the partition and things, that in some ways it was limiting, but that it was also an opportunity to engage this three-tier history of India whole. And I think there's a line where I say, perhaps to be able to form a troika of English, Urdu and Sanskrit. And I went about
You say it in this book?
No, I said it in Stranger to History, in my first book.
You've also said it in this book?
No, it's from the end of Stranger to History.
Really? I thought I remember this troika.
No, it's from
Is that a challenge? What if I find it?
It's a challenge. You won't find it. You won't even find the word troika in this book.
Okay, let's see. I'm pretty sure I read it here.
All right, well,
okay.
You can take me up on that. But and obviously, like, I went about these things like wanting to form, like, to get a kind of perfume as far as the past was concerned. Not necessarily to have direct information, but a feeling, a sensibility. And Sanskrit gave me, I mean, I got much, much more than I bargained for. But that was how the love affair with language began and went forward.
And the cognates was part of that?
The cognates, the nicest thing about it was that I grew up oblivious of the shared history of these languages. I didn't see a word like hriday and think, oh, this is related to Hertz, to Hertzen, to heart, to cordis, to cardio. No one told me these things. I didn't know that there was this shared origin of language. I didn't know that there were these, and I think it would have given me a kind of courage. It would have made me feel that, wow, this was quite a grand thing. You know, that this was, as a story, it's a beautiful story.
So the connection of Indo-European languages was where you felt if children today were made aware of it, it would give them that kind of sustenance and confidence?
It would change their idea of the past. It would make this history of this story of language, they would be able to reach into so much of the West is already in their lives. I feel they would be able, in some ways, to reach into that more freely. That if you can know yourself, you can much more easily appropriate other histories. It's when the ground is cut from you like that, then you lack the confidence to go any further.
Sanskrit has been viewed in the past as a language of the higher caste, an elitist language. And as you have written, Brahmins were doing what Brahmins do best, hoarding knowledge. There is an argument in your book between two characters in which one character is explaining why Sanskrit is important. He's reading it because the Sanskrit is simple, it's over 10 centuries old, it's bound to contain a few anachronisms, but there's more hita in it, more benefit than harm. What benefit? How will it help him to learn this dead language? It'll give him a feeling for the country he lives in, which you've just spoken about, for its past, for its other languages. It'll give him a sense of how things hang together. It will deepen his sensibility. And then the argument goes on, and then he says, how will losing himself in a lifetime of futile study help him join the dots? Now, this is what you're talking about, that we have actually lost the connection to all the dots.
Right.
And which is why we are so eager to grab anything Western without sometimes even understanding it.
Right.
Why we're going through this turbulent sort of social attack, and with Hindutva also raising its head, fighting it. It's become very, very complex, hasn't it?
The history of India is anyway very complex, but if people seem to feel like, I feel especially the present government would think that the humanities were they were a sort of ornament, that you needed them just on the side, you needed to pay lip service to them. They don't realize that actually if you don't give people that sense of wonder, if you don't give them the ability to reach in the past, if you don't give them the ability to make a whole of their historical experience in some ways, that you will cripple them not just in the area of the humanities and in language and things, but in the sciences and mathematics too. That it's that sense of, we can never say what the humanities are for, but it is to, in some ways, give people a sense of wonder, to raise a kind of excitement about the human spirit, and that you feel that very absent at the moment. You feel that a kind of dwarf nation is coming into being, you know, and it's showing it up as real in a practical way as problematic.
I could hear a groan, I think, when you heard of Smriti Irani's decision to introduce Sanskrit in schools. How do you think it should be taught?
I think by a man like Toby, maybe. I think that it should be taught. I think the story of Sanskrit, it's a beautiful story. It's a story of a language that was liturgical. And it had this very dramatic moment around the Shaka invasion where it was used for something it had never been used for before. And it suddenly flowered into a language of politics and statecraft. It spread effortlessly without the force of an army. All Southeast Asia within 200 years was dripping with Sanskrit literature. It was a language with an incredibly self-conscious idea of itself. It was full of meditations on language. There was
rhythm.
A beautifully developed idea of the study of ornament, the idea of the writer. All these things would, in my mind, like from a very young age to older students, it would fill them with excitement. It's an exciting, beautiful story, and in that context, then, if you have to learn the paradigms, and it's hard work. You do have to learn those things, but if you have that running through you, if you have a sense that this is a very grand thing, and this is what you have to do to appropriate it, people maybe would be more willing to do it.
Do you think it could work as a uniting force to have one language as Sanskrit for the whole country?
It doesn't matter. Let that be. Like, it should work as an intellectually exciting force. What Smriti Irani is doing is piety. She wants. You know, in India, we have this way of revering a thing away to death, you know? So make it an object of piety, and then actually you don't have to think about it. But if you make it a thing for the intellect, you have to think very hard about it, you have to work with it. It's a way to make it vital. And this action, which to me speaks of like typical Indian symbolic action, it'll be done. Some pundits will be brought in, there'll be objects of fun and ridicule, there'll be more aversion towards Sanskrit.
And the fear of, I have this vision of somebody making them learn the grammar by rote,
right.
and kids being totally turned off.
It's not spinach, you know?
You've written that a single generation of English education suffices to break the threads of tradition.
This is Kumaraswamy.
Yeah. And to create a nondescript and superficial being deprived of all roots, a sort of intellectual pariah who does not belong to the East or the West, which is what Nehru described himself, incidentally. Have you analyzed why that happened? How did the British so easily take over our souls? How did we give away our souls so easily?
It's so funny because I've been in Banaras covering the election, and a pundit said to me, he said, the Islamic invasions were very destructive. He said they actually were physically destructive. He said, ये अंग्रेजों ने हमारे DNA में injection डाल दिया है. And he said, because of this, ये हमारी तो बिल्कुल तबाही हो गई. Like it's destroyed us. It's destroyed our, and I mean, I don't know if I have a good explanation for why this form. I mean, you know, in your generation, it came so quickly. It came, in fact, after partition. I mean, my grandparents' generation and certain, there was an embarrassment of riches. They not only knew their own languages, they knew other languages. My grandfather was, I think, the first person from the subcontinent to get a PhD in English literature. So he had Arabic and Persian and a bunch of other things. And suddenly there comes this moment after partition where a convent and public school education is introduced. Everyone sends their children to the same things. And an entire middle class is kind of like cut from itself or transported into this world. And neither does English come in that deep, deep way where, you know, you can, and at the same time, the regional language, your own languages start to disappear. And we know what it was like for your generation, but the process, instead of being stopped now, is actually repeating with a kind of fury throughout the country. You meet people like the air hostess in this book, and she's kind of illiterate in 2 and 3 languages. Neither does she speak English, and when you ask her what she speaks at home, she says English is her best language. And you think, wow, it's such an important moment in a country's history. It has nothing better to express itself in than in this kind of rigid, cliched language, which is not going to do anything for you.
Yeah, I mean, very often conversations are reduced to slogans at this point. Aatish, you have written Shifts of Power, the irrelevance of one class, the rise of another, over-refinement in one place, vitality in another. Is that what you see what's happening? Is, for example, language. There was a time when it was taken for granted that people who spoke good English were the ones who'd get the jobs. Today the same situation stands. People who speak good English get the jobs. But the difference today is that in the old days there was an acceptance to it. That okay, they speak better English so they get the jobs. Today there's a huge resentment and anger against people who speak English and get the jobs. And it seems ironical that in our own country, it should be that the mother tongue should be the most powerful and accessible to people in terms of governance or whatever. And somehow we've been disconnected from that. What do you think?
I have a lot of sympathy with that anger because, and I've described this state as almost a state of a kind of linguistic apartheid that people were living under, made to feel terribly small for knowing their own languages. And that transition into modernity, which is tortured as it is, forced them to learn a new language if they were to get anywhere, forced them to shed the things they believed in, to shed ideas. And I think that the people who had English were operating with a very easy power. You know, I mean, they knew, even if you go to a place like Bollywood, which is a Hindi film industry, I mean, you try to be a hero in Bollywood without knowing English. They don't let you in the door. So it was...
There was, you know, Kangana Ranaut was made fun of because her English wasn't perfect and she spoke in an accented English, and it was really rough for her. They all made fun of her.
Yeah. And so it just... And for a while, like, people got by. I thought that I always saw this class of person, our class of person, in a very vulnerable position, and it seemed like it was only a matter of time where someone like the Prime Minister would come around, speaks a very vital, energetic Hindi, and he must give to people who see him a lot of courage. They must think, well, if he's got where he's got, like, and hopefully there'll be place for a whole country to get that way. And you have shocking stories. Even Sheldon Pollock's wife will say she's a scholar of Hindi, and people will say to her, they say, why did you learn this language? She said, it's unimaginable that in China or Russia, someone would say to me that a language that's spoken by 300 or 400 million people, why did you bother to? It comes from tremendous self-loathing, you know?
That's shocking.
Yeah.
One of the things that surprised me in your book, which I had not been exposed to, was the undercurrent of feelings that Sikhs had during Mrs. Gandhi's siege in Amritsar, and then her murder afterwards. And in this you discuss a character, IP, IP's mood, which had been jubilant in his room when he first suspected the news, that is of her being killed, grew heavier as they made their way out. He sensed his isolation. Perhaps he already had an intimation of consequences and felt something of the solitude and threat of a man whose team wins the cricket even as he finds himself in a town filled with supporters of the losing side. So he has to hide his jubilance with shame. And then you also write, the violence of a repressed society, though men may dress it up as anger or grief, has the quality of a celebration. Those who participate in it know that at bottom what they feel is release and euphoria. And you've seen that in crowds, in riots. Yeah. There is that euphoric thing. But tell me more about this. You have obviously been on the inside of Sikh families who have discussed Indira Gandhi's actions, going into the Golden Temple, ordering the army to go in, and then her killing. Did you also feel schizophrenic in terms of having to hide what you were actually feeling, or you were too young?
I have to say that Amos Oz has this line where he says that his childhood in Jerusalem gave him an education in comparative fanaticism. And I have to say that I've had this particular experience on the subcontinent that everyone thinks I'm their guy. Whether it's the Sikhs, there's a warmth. With Hindus, they feel that, and Muslims, of course, think, and they all confide to me the vilest things about the other group, you know? So it's never, it's kind of almost like made me a little bit desensitized to that kind of prejudice. But yes, I mean, the Sikh household I grew up in, it was very much like Muslim prejudice for the Sikhs. They were kind of considered weak, unmanly. We defended India. There was this sense that, you know, you put one Sikh against 100 Hindus and they would you know, so there was this sort of thing. And Mrs. Gandhi was loathed. They thought she was an evil woman. And there was, and certainly very many, the Sikhs were happy when she was killed. It's hard to, in fact, I know somebody who called up sort of someone in my family and said, well done, you guys. You know, there was this kind of thing, and there's as much as there's this feeling among Hindus that Sikhs are part of the community, Sikhs themselves differentiate themselves very strongly.
So that was, you know, not commonly known or exposed.
Yeah.
And because Sikhs certainly don't go to a Hindu and say, listen, we are not, you are a weakling, we're not part of you.
Right.
And
now you also have to know that this is especially high, this feeling, in the 80s.
Yes.
You know, there's Bhimrao Malik saying things very much along this line. Yes. Even referring to Mrs. Gandhi, I think, as the Panditain or something like that. There was very much that sense, and so a lot of it is also historically specific. But
you've spoken about prejudice. For one of the peculiarities about prejudice is that it seems always to speak from the heart. It seems in some daring way to be speaking the truth, to be saying what others secretly believe, but do not have the courage to say themselves. And the man who speaks against prejudice can often come to seem like the peddler of shop-worn banalities, while the voice of prejudice can seem bold and original, a lone voice with the power to drown out others, the power to subdue. Now, this is a thread that also is in your book, your reaction to Hindutva, which I'll come to a little later. But what I wanted to ask you is related to this passage. Have you experienced prejudice in your life? A young boy brought up in a Sikh household, then going to Pakistan, and so with your feet in many different countries. What has been your personal experience? If you enjoyed that, click up here to support us and down here to subscribe. Be sure to check out our older episodes and the other stuff we do, like Can You Take It, I Agree, panel discussions, comics and animations, and much, much more.